Imagine a world where history took a darker turn, where the Second World War ended not in liberation, but in the rise of an empire that claimed to bring peace through absolute control. In this alternate timeline, the Axis powers have triumphed. Europe, Asia, and even the Americas are reshaped by ideology, technology, and silence. This is the story of what might have been, a calm, reflective journey through a world that traded freedom for perfection and slowly forgot what it meant to be human. Welcome to History to Relax, where we explore history and imagination in a way that helps you unwind, think deeply, and drift into another time. If you enjoy stories that blend the beauty of history with the quiet rhythm of reflection, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Your messages truly help this channel grow and connect history lovers from every corner of the world. Now, take a deep breath, find a comfortable place to rest, and let the noise of the day fade away. The lights of the Empire are still burning, and our story begins. Part 1. Victory Day in Berlin. The war had ended, but not in the way the old world had hoped. On a bright spring morning, the city of Berlin stood reborn at the center of a continent subdued. Marble facades gleamed where ruins once lay. Streets ran straight and clean beneath flags that stretched down every building, red and white against polished stone. The scent of fuel and newly cut granite filled the air. Across the rebuilt capital, the population gathered for the first celebration of what officials called Victory Day. It was the dawn of a new age, the opening ceremony of the world that the Reich had promised for decades. Loudspeakers hidden in walls and lampposts carried the soft hum of martial music. In the central squares, soldiers lined the boulevards with machine-like precision. Behind them, families stood in quiet rows, children clutching small banners bearing the eagle and the cross. There was no shouting, no chaos, only order. From balconies overlooking the avenue, voices of announcers rolled through the morning air. They thanked the armies of the Reich for their sacrifice, honored the engineers who had brought light to every household, and praised the unity that had delivered peace to the world. Every word was measured, calm, and absolute. The tone of the new era was not rage or passion, it was certainty. At the end of the Grand Avenue rose the newly built Arch of Triumph, a colossal structure of stone and steel. Carved figures of soldiers, laborers, and mothers blended into one continuous design. The inscription above read simply, "Through struggle, peace." Beneath it burned an eternal blue flame, reflected in the shining plaza that spread outward in all directions. The parade began at 10. Tanks rolled first, their engines steady but subdued, polished to a mirror sheen. Infantry divisions followed, boots striking the ground in perfect rhythm. Each face was expressionless, each movement rehearsed until human difference had been replaced by mechanical grace. The crowd responded not with cheers, but with silence. Their reverence had the stillness of ritual. After the soldiers came the banners of conquered lands: France, Norway, the Netherlands, Poland, and finally Britain. Each flag was carried by German officers, the nations they represented reduced to ornaments of triumph. From a raised platform, the Chancellor of the Greater Germanic Reich observed the procession. He was not a fiery speaker like his predecessor, but an administrator chosen for his calm authority. When he raised his hand, the entire plaza mirrored the gesture as one body. The event was broadcast to every corner of the empire. In Oslo and Vienna, in Paris and Prague, citizens watched on identical screens as Berlin displayed its unity. The same words, the same music, the same light filled every home. For millions, the image of the parade was not merely a celebration. It was confirmation that history had ended and order had prevailed. Above the city, slow-moving airships drifted through the clear sky, scattering clouds of silver confetti that shimmered like snow. The new architecture of Berlin gleamed beneath them. Vast ministries of pale stone lined the avenues, their facades decorated with statues representing virtues, strength, loyalty, and sacrifice. No buildings bore the names of individuals. The age of personality had been replaced by the worship of ideals. In classrooms, children had already been taught to salute portraits of the Führer each morning. They would now salute the future instead. Teachers told them that they were living at the dawn of humanity's perfection. Science, order, and obedience had replaced doubt. Across Europe, propaganda repeated the same promise, that peace and purity were one and the same. At noon, the parade reached Victory Square, where the newly completed Hall of Nations waited. It was a circular building crowned with a glass dome beneath which the leaders of the Axis gathered. The chamber's floor was inlaid with a world map showing the territories under Axis control, colored in pale gold. The eagle of the Reich spread its wings from Europe to the Pacific. One by one, delegates from Italy, Japan, Hungary, and Spain stepped forward to sign the Global Concord, the treaty that formalized permanent cooperation under German leadership. Cameras flashed. Each signature represented the surrender of independence disguised as harmony. When the final pen left the paper, the orchestra struck a solemn note, and the broadcast voice declared the moment to be the birth of eternal peace. As the sun set, the day softened into a glow of celebration. Lights illuminated the ministries, tracing their outlines in white and gold. Crowds filled the parks along the Spree River to watch fireworks bursting above the skyline. The reflections of color danced on the water, and the city looked serene, so perfect that it seemed almost unreal. Yet beneath the surface, a different silence lingered. The ruins of the old Gestapo tunnels still ran below the government quarter, sealed but not forgotten. The ghosts of the vanished world remained there, the voices of those who had been erased to make this peace possible. Above ground, no one spoke of them. The past had been rewritten, and forgetting had become a civic virtue. In apartments across Berlin, families ended the day listening to the radio. The same voice that had spoken in the morning now returned for the closing broadcast. It thanked the citizens for their devotion, reminded them to remain vigilant, and spoke of the new human century that had begun under the sign of order. Outside, the city lights burned through the night without flicker or failure. From above, the capital appeared flawless. Streets formed perfect grids. Trains glided along elevated rails without noise. Monuments cast long, even shadows across the plazas. The city that once trembled under bombs now slept in disciplined silence. But beneath the calm geometry, something essential was gone. No laughter rose from open windows. No dissenting song broke through the walls of official harmony. Every building, every park, every sound had been measured and approved. The result was peace without life, beauty without freedom. At midnight, the blue flame at the base of the Arch of Triumph burned steady in the wind. Guards stood motionless on either side, their reflections trembling in the polished stone beneath their boots. Overhead, the old searchlights rose once again, sweeping across the sky until their beams converged into a pale dome above the city. The announcers called it the Canopy of Unity. Citizens looked upward, seeing not light but confirmation of their own submission. Far beyond the capital, in the quiet villages and occupied cities of the continent, people also looked toward the same sky. The same broadcasts reached them, the same speeches echoed through their radios. The entire world had become an extension of Berlin's order. The historians of this future would later describe Victory Day as the moment when humanity entered a new kind of silence. They would note how the machinery of conquest transformed into the machinery of governance, how the instruments of destruction became the tools of administration. The totalitarian dream had achieved what it always promised, a perfect society built on obedience. And yet, even in that perfection, traces of the old world remained. In the cracks between parades and proclamations, memory lingered. Somewhere, hidden behind walls and archives, there were still names unrecorded and stories untold. The empire called itself eternal, but beneath the marble and steel it rested upon the quiet absence of those who could no longer speak. When dawn approached again, the city was already awake. Street cleaners moved through the squares, sweeping away the silver confetti from the day before. The banners remained in place. The loudspeakers played soft music to welcome the new workday. Berlin stood immaculate, untouched by doubt. Victory Day had fulfilled its purpose. It had shown the world not what it had gained, but what it had lost: the possibility of imperfection, the voice of freedom, the human noise of disagreement. The 1,000-year peace had begun. Part 2. Europe rebuilt in iron. When the guns fell silent across the continent, Europe no longer resembled the patchwork of nations that had once filled its maps. What emerged from the ashes was not peace, but a single order, an empire forged from fear, efficiency, and ideology. The war had ended, yet the machinery of conquest continued to turn, reshaping every border and every life beneath the banners of the Reich. Berlin, ruled from the center of a continent remade. To the west stretched a network of protectorates and client states, their governments outwardly independent, but inwardly obedient. To the east lay a vast frontier, territory designated for settlement and exploitation. The empire's architects had imagined a Europe without contradiction, without dissent, and above all, without diversity. In the years that followed Victory Day, that vision began to harden into reality. Across France, the remnants of the Vichy regime became permanent. Paris, long the symbol of art and revolution, turned into a showcase of collaboration. German architects rebuilt its boulevards with grand precision, lining them with monuments to order and obedience. The city's famous cafes reopened, but the conversations within them were cautious, stripped of politics and irony. French newspapers printed stories approved by the Reich's Ministry of Culture, describing prosperity, efficiency, and the rebirth of European civilization under German guidance. The museums remained open, but many of their treasures had been quietly relocated to Berlin for safekeeping. In the Low Countries, the occupation became assimilation. Dutch and Belgian industries were reorganized into the Reich's economic system. Ports such as Rotterdam and Antwerp served as gateways for the movement of resources from Africa and the Atlantic colonies. The people worked in silence, their lives tightly measured by production quotas. Resistance had long been eradicated, not by mass executions, but by the slow suffocation of hope. Further north, Scandinavia was absorbed through a blend of flattery and coercion. Norway's coastline became a military bastion controlling the northern seas. Sweden, still proud of its neutrality, entered the new order as a cultural ally, its scientists and engineers contributing to the empire's technological expansion. From Oslo to Stockholm, the language of propaganda was the same: unity, strength, and the duty of the Nordic race to lead humanity. The policies of eugenics, once whispered in laboratories, became the foundation of public health. In Central Europe, the transformation went deeper. Austria and the Czech lands were fully integrated as provinces of the Reich. Prague, once a city of scholars and dissenters, now served as a model administrative capital. Streets bore German names, and universities taught only the approved version of history. Music and art continued to exist, but only within narrow boundaries. The great orchestras performed compositions reworked to fit ideological purity, their melodies stripped of dissonance. To live within this order was to live inside a script written by others. Farther east, the picture darkened. Beyond the old Polish border stretched the territories of the general government, now renamed the Eastern Colonies. There, the regime's long-term plan, known internally as General Plan Ost, had taken root. Entire regions were cleared of their original populations, their towns erased from maps. Forests and fields were divided into settlement zones for German families. Roads extended in straight lines across what had once been living landscapes, connecting new agricultural estates with fortified towns. The native populations that survived were reduced to permanent servitude. In what had been Poland and Ukraine, vast agricultural complexes fed the Reich cities. Millions of laborers drawn from conquered peoples worked under the supervision of German overseers. The system was efficient, brutal, and quiet. Hunger had been replaced by exhaustion, rebellion by resignation. A generation of children grew up knowing no other world, their languages forbidden, their names changed to fit German registers. To the south, Italy ruled its own empire under German supervision. The Mediterranean was declared a closed sea, its coast lined with military ports and fascist monuments. Rome proclaimed the revival of the ancient empire, but its independence was largely ceremonial. German advisors oversaw its economy, and its armies operated under joint command. The dream of a new Roman Empire had survived, but only as a subordinate partner within the Greater Reich. The Balkans remained a region of tension and quiet terror. Croatia, Bulgaria, and Greece existed as satellites, obedient in public, unstable in private. Partisan remnants hid in the mountains, hunted by occupation forces. Whole villages were relocated or erased in the process of pacification. The empire preferred silence over resistance and order over memory. The result was a landscape where fear became as common as air. By the end of the 1950s, a traveler crossing the continent would have seen uniformity everywhere. From Lisbon to Riga, every major city displayed the same architectural language: grand avenues, geometric plazas, and monumental government buildings of stone and steel. Each square bore an identical statue of the eagle, wings spread above the globe. The diversity of Europe had been replaced by an aesthetic of control. To walk through these cities was to move through a mirror world of symmetry and surveillance. The empire's infrastructure bound the continent together. The Autobahn network stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Euro frontier, connecting resource zones, factories, and administrative centers. High-speed trains, designed by German engineers, ran with mechanical precision. Every border crossing had been erased within the Reich's domain. The movement of goods and soldiers was seamless. The movement of ideas was forbidden. The population was classified into tiers of citizenship. At the top stood the pure-blooded Germans, followed by the assimilated Aryans of Northern and Western Europe. Slavic peoples occupied the lowest rank, their lives restricted to labor zones and controlled settlements. Marriage laws regulated every union. Births were recorded according to genetic value. The state described it as a scientific approach to evolution. In practice, it was an empire built on inherited privilege and institutional cruelty. Education reinforced the same hierarchy. Schools across the continent used identical textbooks printed in Berlin. History lessons taught that the old democracies had collapsed under their own weakness. Students learned that freedom without order had led to decay, and that obedience had saved civilization. Geography books depicted the world in shades of gold and gray: gold for Axis territories, gray for the unpacified zones still awaiting enlightenment. In universities, philosophy and literature were tolerated only as long as they served ideological ends. Scholars wrote about the harmony between race and destiny. Historians described conquest as renewal. Artists painted landscapes of perfect symmetry and portraits of model citizens. Art that questioned, mourned, or doubted disappeared quietly into archives labeled unfit for display. Religion survived, but in altered form. Churches that had once opposed fascism now preached a theology of obedience. Crosses and altars shared space with the insignia of the state. In some regions, Christianity was replaced entirely by the cult of destiny, a belief system crafted by propagandists to fuse faith with loyalty. The human spirit had been disciplined into alignment with power. Economically, the New Europe appeared prosperous. Factories operated at full capacity, producing goods for both military and civilian use. Unemployment vanished, replaced by universal assignment. Each citizen worked where the state required them. Vacations were organized through government programs that sent workers to identical seaside resorts, where rest followed schedules and entertainment carried moral instruction. To the outside world, the empire presented itself as a miracle of order. Propaganda films showed clean streets, disciplined families, and well-fed children. Foreign journalists invited to visit saw only what they were meant to see: modern hospitals, efficient farms, smiling workers. The darker machinery of control remained invisible, hidden behind the facades of progress. Censorship operated not through terror, but through perfection. Newspapers, radio, and the emerging medium of television offered only one version of truth. The populace no longer recognized the absence of alternatives. When every image, every headline, and every melody repeated the same message, silence became indistinguishable from consent. Underneath this surface, Europe had lost something essential. The variety of languages, customs, and traditions that once gave the continent its texture had been flattened into conformity. Folk songs, dialects, and local holidays faded from memory. Whole libraries of banned books were destroyed in controlled burnings that were never publicly acknowledged. The empire preferred a continent without friction, a culture without debate. The old cities, Paris, Warsaw, Amsterdam, and Budapest remained beautiful, but their beauty had been sterilized. Tourists from within the Reich admired their orderliness, their cleanliness, their absence of crime. They did not see what was missing: the unpredictability of life, the laughter from crowded cafes, the creative chaos that once defined Europe. In official reports, the leadership called this transformation the completion of civilization. They claimed that the continent had entered its mature stage, free of conflict and guided by reason. In reality, the iron structure that held it together had stripped away its humanity. The peace that followed victory was not the calm of reconciliation, but the stillness of domination. By the time the 20th century reached its middle decades, a generation had grown up knowing no other system. They spoke the same phrases, read the same news, and believed the same truths. To them, the Reich's order was not tyranny but normality. Europe had been rebuilt, its cities strong, its people obedient, its culture silent. The historians of this future would describe the era as one of stability and stagnation. Progress continued in technology and architecture, but imagination withered. The continent stood like a monument cast in iron, enduring, gleaming, and hollow within. Part 3. The Silent Isles. When the guns along the channel finally fell silent, the island that had once defied the Reich became its newest province. The invasion had come later than planned and at terrible cost, but by the spring of 1947 the German flag hung above Westminster. Britain, undefeated for 1,000 years, awoke to occupation. At first the change felt like an extension of war. London still smelled of smoke and rubble. Ration cards remained, soldiers filled the streets, and the air carried the distant thrum of aircraft from the coastal bases. The new administrators promised reconstruction. They called themselves liberators from chaos and claimed that England's destiny was to join the new European order. Many citizens, weary of bombing and hunger, believed them, or at least pretended to. The first years were harsh. Parliament was dissolved, and the monarchy quietly removed to Canada under the pretext of temporary relocation. In its place, a Council of National Renewal governed under German supervision. British fascists who had once lingered at the margins suddenly reappeared in tailored uniforms, eager to prove their loyalty. Propaganda posters covered the walls of every town. Unity is peace. Work is honor. Europe is one. Daily life settled into a pattern of obedience. Shops reopened, though their windows displayed only the basics: bread, sugar, soap, and government-issue clothing. The pound was replaced by the Reichsmark, linking the island's economy directly to Berlin. Radio broadcasts began each morning with the same anthem, followed by news written in both German and English. The tone was always polite, factual, and final. Schools were among the first institutions to change. New textbooks arrived from the continent, printed on thick gray paper and adorned with symbols of the Reich. History lessons no longer spoke of Magna Carta or parliamentary rights. Instead, they praised the unity of the Aryan peoples and the triumph of discipline over weakness. Latin and Greek were replaced with compulsory German. Students learned the geography of the new Europe, where borders had vanished and the map glowed in one color of authority. Teachers who resisted disappeared quietly. Some were arrested for corruption of youth, others dismissed for health reasons and never seen again. Within a few years, an entire generation grew up speaking German as fluently as English, reciting slogans instead of poems. Censorship reached every corner of culture. The BBC became the British Rundfunkanstalt, broadcasting sanitized music and carefully selected literature. Shakespeare survived, but only in edited form, his tragedies reinterpreted as warnings against disorder. Libraries were purged of subversive texts, and printing presses operated under license. In the New London, information flowed in one direction only. The police, renamed the Civil Guard, wore dark gray uniforms patterned after the SS. They were efficient, polite, and omnipresent. Identification checks became part of daily routine. Conversations lowered in volume, humor retreated into private circles. Londoners learned to speak in half sentences, to smile without committing. The silence that settled over the island was not one of peace, but of exhaustion. By the early 1950s, visible resistance had ended. The last guerrilla bands in the Scottish Highlands were hunted down, and their leaders executed in secret. Newspapers printed photographs of reconstructed cities, Manchester, Coventry, and Bristol rising again under the benevolent guidance of European engineers. The images were real, but the meaning was hollow. Britain had been rebuilt, yet its soul had been nationalized. The regime understood the power of comfort. Rationing gradually eased, factories reopened, and wages stabilized. New motorways and rail lines connected every major city to the Channel Tunnel, completed under German direction. A generation born during war now entered adulthood amid apparent prosperity. The lights were on, the trains on time, and the news consistent. For many, that was enough. Yet beneath the order, memory persisted. Old songs survived in whispers. In back rooms of pubs and church basements, banned books circulated. Orwell, Milton, and the diaries of exiled politicians. A hidden network of teachers and clergy preserved fragments of the past, knowing that history was the last form of rebellion. They called themselves simply the Rememberers. The 1960s brought the illusion of normality. The Council of National Renewal transformed into the British Administrative Authority, headquartered in London's redesigned Whitehall district. German advisors no longer needed to supervise directly. British officials trained in Berlin now managed their own subjugation. Television arrived, sleek and persuasive, showing smiling families in modern housing estates, children playing under portraits of the Chancellor. Every program carried the same undertone, that freedom was disorder, and order was love. Cultural life resumed, though sterilized. Art galleries reopened, but exhibits required approval. Abstract expressionism was banned for degeneracy. Instead, realism and neoclassical purity dominated portraits of workers, landscapes of perfect farms, cities without litter or crowds. Music turned orchestral and grand, stripped of jazz or blues influences, which were declared foreign and corrosive. In pubs, musicians still played softly after curfew, their melodies carrying the faint rhythm of defiance that the microphones could not quite erase. Religion faced its own transformation. The Church of England, stripped of political influence, redefined its message to survive. Sermons emphasized duty and cleanliness of spirit. Prayers for the exiled royal family were forbidden. Some clergy resisted quietly, encoding messages of endurance within the language of faith. Others embraced collaboration, claiming that the new order represented divine destiny. The pews stayed full, but the words felt heavier. In the countryside, collective farms replaced estates. Peasants who once worked for landowners now served the agricultural authority, their quotas posted on public boards. Villages became models of efficiency. Whitewashed cottages, mechanical tractors, loudspeakers that played "Approve" music at dawn. Children in uniform saluted before breakfast, their futures already planned by the state. The rhythm of seasons continued, but the meaning of labor had changed. By the 1970s, occupation had evolved into inheritance. The young no longer remembered the war. For them, the Reich's presence was natural, almost invisible. German companies owned the factories, German universities directed the research institutes, and German tourists filled the restored resorts of Brighton and Blackpool. The English language remained, but its edges softened. Newspapers sprinkled phrases of German origin into headlines. Even the weather reports began with the phrase Guten Morgen, Britannian. Yet cracks began to appear in the polished facade. Industrial efficiency could rebuild cities, but not erase history. The old generation, those who had lived through the invasion, grew restless as they aged. They remembered another kind of Britain, the smell of coal and rain, the chaos of free debate, the noise of crowds unafraid to shout. Letters smuggled from Canada and the United States told of democracies that still survived across the ocean. Reading them was illegal, but hope once remembered is difficult to unlearn. The security services noticed a rise in sentimental disobedience. Citizens caught singing band songs, painting small crowns on walls, or leaving flowers near statues of erased leaders. The punishments were mild at first: loss of work, relocation to rural labor colonies, re-education programs. But each act reminded the regime that silence could never be complete. The government responded by deepening surveillance. Microphones were installed in public buildings, and every household radio carried a hidden receiver that monitored frequencies. The population learned new habits, never speaking politics indoors, never trusting unfamiliar neighbors. Fear became etiquette. Still, resistance endured, subtle and persistent. Teachers included forbidden poems between lessons. Librarians preserved unapproved books inside false covers. Artists painted landscapes with coded messages: one tree for every year of the old monarchy, a distant horizon shaped like a lion. None of these gestures could overthrow a regime, but they kept memory alive, and memory was the one thing tyranny could never fully regulate. By the late 1970s, London stood as a symbol of what the Reich called mature civilization. The Thames flowed between glass towers designed in Berlin, its bridges lit with white floodlights that erased the night. Airships and helicopters patrolled the skies, and the city below moved like a clock. There was no crime worth mentioning, no homelessness, and no dissent that reached the surface. The British administrative authority boasted of 50 years without civil unrest. It was a truth, but not the whole truth. Beneath the surface, London still whispered. In abandoned underground stations, artists and thinkers gathered after curfew to speak freely. They read from banned novels, sang old hymns, and remembered the sound of laughter unapproved by the state. These meetings were rare and dangerous, but their existence proved that even after decades of control, the human spirit still sought imperfection. Outside the city, the landscape told its own quiet story. The white cliffs of Dover bore a new monument, a massive eagle carved into the rock, visible from every arriving ship. The message was clear: the island's independence had ended forever. Yet at the base of that cliff, beneath layers of chalk and salt spray, someone had scratched a line of defiance in small letters, faded but legible. "We are still here." By the century's end, the Silent Isles lived up to their name. Streets were clean, order absolute, and history forgotten. But silence, however deep, is never total. Somewhere within the hum of machines, within the quiet breathing of millions, there remained an echo, the memory of a people who once spoke freely and might one day again. Part 4. The Eastern Colonies. When victory in the West had been secured, attention turned eastward. The new empire, confident in its permanence, began the second phase of its expansion, the creation of the Eastern Colonies. To the planners in Berlin, this vast territory stretching from Poland through Ukraine and deep into Russia represented the future of the Reich. In their vision, Europe would no longer end at the Vistula River. It would extend unbroken to the Urals, a continent reordered and purified by design. The blueprint already existed. Years before the war had ended, bureaucrats in the Ministry for the occupied Eastern Territories drafted maps, quotas, and population tables. Their project was called General Plan Lust. It envisioned the displacement, enslavement, or elimination of tens of millions of people to make room for German settlers. The war's end simply allowed those plans to proceed without resistance. From 1947 onward, entire provinces were reclassified. Poland ceased to exist as a nation. Its western regions were absorbed directly into the Reich, while the central and eastern areas became Reichsgau, colonial districts administered by SS officials. Ukraine and Belarus were reorganized into agricultural protectorates. Cities were renamed, villages redrawn, and populations catalogued like inventory. The empire treated land and life as interchangeable parts of a single machine. New railways cut through forests and plains, connecting the eastern colonies to the industrial heart of Germany. The trains carried settlers eastward and laborers westward, an endless exchange of masters and servants. German families were offered fertile farmland and modern housing in territories once inhabited by Poles, Ukrainians, and Russians. They were told they were pioneers, civilizing the wilderness. To many, it felt like opportunity. To others, it was exile disguised as destiny. For the native populations, the new order arrived with quiet brutality. Local administrations were dismantled, churches repurposed, and schools closed. The teaching of native languages was forbidden. Identity cards replaced citizenship, and movement required official permission. Those deemed useful were assigned to labor farms, factories, or construction brigades. The rest were relocated, often to nowhere. Records show entire villages disappearing from census reports, erased not by battle but by policy. The regime built its authority on the promise of efficiency. Agricultural production was planned to feed the continent, with the East serving as its granary. Massive state farms replaced traditional ones. The land was divided into grids, each managed by German overseers trained in agronomy and discipline. Laborers woke before dawn to the sound of whistles, worked under armed supervision, and returned to dormitories by curfew. Meals were rationed, wages symbolic. The system functioned with the precision of an assembly line, and with the same disregard for individual lives. In the new towns built for settlers, the contrast was striking. The streets were paved, houses identical and spotless. Schools taught children the virtues of expansion and sacrifice. Festivals celebrated the conquest of space and soil. In public squares stood statues of farmers holding wheat in one hand and rifles in the other. The settlers believed they were living at the edge of civilization's frontier, fulfilling a historical mission. Few asked what had happened to those who had lived there before. Resistance persisted but carried no illusions. Forests across Belarus and Ukraine became havens for partisans, though their numbers dwindled with each passing year. The Empire's security forces, an intricate web of local police, SS units, and intelligence offices, crushed uprisings before they began. Punishment was collective. For every act of defiance, a village was relocated, its name struck from maps. Fear spread faster than rebellion. The Empire also sought to reshape the region's culture. Monuments, churches, and cemeteries were destroyed or converted into symbols of the new order. Folk traditions were appropriated, cleansed of their original meaning, and reintroduced as quaint relics under imperial sponsorship. The past was rebranded as folklore, safe for display but stripped of truth. By the 1950s, the demographic transformation had begun in earnest. German settlers occupied vast stretches of land from Krakow to Kiev, living in isolated colonies linked by guarded highways. Each community had its own school, clinic, and administrative office. Everything was recorded, measured, and ranked. The Empire valued order above compassion, and statistics above stories. For those at the bottom of this hierarchy, life was a daily negotiation between survival and obedience. A worker could earn small privileges, a warmer coat, a shorter workday, a few extra rations by meeting quotas. Failure led to relocation or disappearance. Yet even within this machinery, traces of humanity persisted. Laborers shared food in secret, sang old songs after curfew, and passed along fragments of banned prayers. Every act of memory became an act of defiance. Over time, the system began to consume itself. Bureaucracy multiplied faster than success. Reports from the eastern provinces told of declining productivity, shortages of labor, and growing discontent among settlers unaccustomed to hardship. The soil of the steppe proved less obedient than ideology promised. Droughts returned, transport lines broke down, and entire colonies failed. The Reich responded with more supervision, more planning, and more fear. In the archives of the 1960s, one can read the minutes of administrative meetings where officials debated how to manage a population that refused to disappear. They spoke of inefficient compliance and residual ethnic resilience, as if human beings were technical problems. Their language revealed the moral vacuum at the heart of the empire, the belief that order justified any cruelty as long as it remained quiet and precise. By the 1970s, the Eastern Colonies had settled into a grim equilibrium. The native population, decimated and fragmented, existed in the margins, workers without citizenship, ghosts within their own lands. German towns flourished on the surface, modern and prosperous, while beyond their perimeters stretched zones of silence where history had been erased. Travelers described an unsettling stillness, villages rebuilt but uninhabited, roads leading to nowhere, landscapes too neat to feel alive. The empire declared success. Propaganda films showed smiling settlers harvesting grain, children playing beneath banners, and wide fields shimmering under mechanical harvesters. Officials spoke proudly of a century of progress. Yet the reality beneath the images was fragile. Every road, every field, every town rested upon absence. Beneath the fertile soil lay the unrecorded cost of conquest. Some historians of that era, writing in secret, called the Eastern Territories the Empire's mirror. In their view, the colonies revealed the true face of the regime, its dependence on hierarchy, its fear of difference, its worship of control. The same system that promised unity contained the seeds of its decay. A world that sought to eliminate disorder had also eliminated renewal. By the end of the century, the grand vision of a Germanized East was incomplete. Settlers complained of isolation. Laborers vanished into cities in search of anonymity. The empire maintained its facade of perfection, but its heart had grown hollow. The land remained rich, but the spirit that once animated it had been extinguished. The Eastern Colonies endured as both achievement and warning, a landscape rebuilt in iron, efficient yet lifeless. For generations, maps would show them as part of the empire's core, their borders marked by straight lines and numbers. But beneath those lines, memory persisted. It waited in unmarked graves, in the ruins of churches converted to barns, in the faint songs that laborers still whispered when the night was safe enough to dream. Part 5. The SS Empire. By the middle of the 20th century, power within the Reich no longer rested with a single leader but with an institution, the Schutzstaffel, or SS. What had begun as a small paramilitary guard in the early years of the movement had evolved into the empire's governing backbone. After victory in the war, it absorbed the duties of administration, security, and ideology until no aspect of life remained untouched by its reach. Historians of the New Order would later describe it as the empire behind the empire. The transformation happened gradually. When Berlin declared peace, the army demobilized and the traditional ministries returned to civilian hands. Yet the SS did not dissolve. It presented itself as the guarantor of purity and order, the invisible force ensuring that the empire's ideals would not decay through comfort or compromise. Every conquered territory contained a regional SS headquarters, every government ministry an SS liaison. Over time, the distinction between civil and military power blurred until they became one. At its height, the SS operated like a state within a state. It controlled vast industrial holdings through front companies, managed agricultural estates in the Eastern Colonies, and oversaw research institutes in medicine, genetics, and engineering. Its hierarchy resembled both a corporation and a religious order, ranks defined not only by authority but by ideological devotion. Admission required proof of ancestry, physical health, and unquestioning loyalty. Its members called themselves the custodians of destiny. The SS divided its rule into departments, each with a clear function. The Security Directorate maintained internal order, monitoring the population through networks of informants and data registries. The Economic Office managed labor distribution and industrial planning. The Cultural Bureau oversaw education, propaganda, and the arts, ensuring that every word and image served the state. In theory, these divisions worked independently, but in practice they formed a seamless chain of control. Technology magnified their efficiency. The empire invested heavily in record-keeping machines, early computers built by German engineers that processed census data, work quotas, and background files. Every citizen's life could be traced in coded numbers, birthplace, occupation, ancestry, loyalty rating. The SS called it the system of harmony. To those who designed it, it represented progress, the replacement of chance and error with mathematics. For ordinary people, it became the architecture of fear. Identity cards contained invisible markers that determined access to education, housing, and employment. Travel required permission codes verified against central databases. Even personal correspondence passed through scanners that flagged unconstructive sentiment. The state rarely needed visible punishment. Awareness of surveillance was often enough. In cities across the continent, the SS presence was quiet, but absolute. Black uniformed officers appeared at ceremonies, schools, and workplaces, their composure polished and their language bureaucratic. They rarely shouted or threatened. Orders came on letterhead, sealed with official insignia. The violence of the early years had been replaced by procedural inevitability. When the system decided that someone no longer fit within its harmony, they simply ceased to appear in records. The organization also shaped the Empire's culture. The SS considered itself the guardian of European identity, curating museums, publishing textbooks, and sponsoring scientific conferences. It promoted art that celebrated strength, precision, and obedience. Modernist experimentation was condemned as chaotic expressionism, while romantic landscapes and heroic portraits filled galleries. Films portrayed the Empire as a family of nations guided by discipline. Beauty itself became a tool of governance. Within the SS, education followed a strict code. Cadets studied genetics, history, and administrative law. They were trained to view governance as a form of moral engineering, society as an organism to be perfected through guidance and correction. Compassion was described as inefficiency, doubt as weakness. Graduates entered the bureaucracy with the calm confidence of doctors treating a patient who could not be consulted about their own condition. As the organization expanded, its influence reached every profession. Judges, engineers, and university professors carried dual ranks, answering both to their ministries and to the SS inspectors assigned to them. The uniform itself evolved from black to a neutral gray, designed to blend with civilian attire. The ideal officer was not a soldier, but an administrator who embodied order in both thought and gesture. In the Eastern Colonies, the SS served as both governor and priesthood. It supervised the settlement program, allocated land to German families, and managed the labor population that sustained them. Reports from the provinces read like agricultural statistics: hectares cultivated, productivity ratios, population transfers. The language of management concealed the suffering beneath it. To question the figures was to question the system, and the system was infallible. Life under SS governance followed a pattern of quiet conformity. Cities were immaculate, public behavior disciplined, crime virtually non-existent. People learned to police themselves, anticipating what would be acceptable before it needed to be enforced. Small rituals replaced open coercion, weekly gatherings where citizens pledged loyalty, public commendations for efficiency, broadcasts praising those who exceeded work quotas. Obedience became a social currency. Yet, even in this atmosphere, the boundaries of power bred corruption. Ambitious officers competed for influence, trading favors and manipulating statistics to secure promotions. Entire careers were built on maintaining the illusion of perfection. When numbers failed to match expectations, they were adjusted. Success became performance, and truth a matter of presentation. Ordinary citizens adapted as best they could. For many, compliance was not ideology, but survival. They learned to smile at inspections, to repeat official phrases, to keep their private thoughts unspoken. Fear became habitual, woven into the rhythm of daily life. Letters between relatives used coded language, discussing weather when referring to politics, illness when speaking of suspicion. Within this restrained world, kindness became an act of courage performed in whispers. The SS also extended its reach into science. Institutes once devoted to war research shifted toward genetic studies and environmental control. The Empire sought to standardize not only society but nature itself, designing crops that conformed to quotas, breeding animals for uniformity, experimenting with controlled climates. The same mentality that organized populations now attempted to organize the planet. The results were impressive in scale, but soulless in intent. Religion had long been subordinated to the state, but the SS developed its own quasi-spiritual ideology. It spoke of blood and destiny in ceremonial language, blending myth with biology. Its officers performed rituals of initiation, swearing oaths before symbols of eternity. They saw themselves not as servants of a government, but as caretakers of civilization's divine mission. To the rest of the population, these ceremonies were distant and mysterious, half rumor, half theater. By the 1970s, the SS had become the silent framework holding the empire together. Its archives contain the most complete record of human life ever assembled. Its schools produced generations of administrators who knew nothing beyond the system that had created them. To the world outside, the Reich appeared unshakable, an edifice of order built on knowledge and faith in control, and yet cracks began to show. The same precision that had given the SS its power now revealed its fragility. When every action depended on flawless obedience, even small deviations became threats. Reports of falsified data, smuggled art, and hidden families surfaced within the bureaucracy. Some officers began to question whether purity could ever be achieved without destroying what made society human. Their doubts were quiet, but they spread. The empire's historians would later write that its decline began not with rebellion but with fatigue. The machinery of perfection demanded endless vigilance, and human beings, even disciplined ones, could not sustain it forever. Behind the polished facades and immaculate uniforms, weariness took root. Some officers turned to ritual, others to silence. The people they ruled sensed it too, the stillness of a system that had outlived its purpose. By the century's end, the SS still governed the empire, but its certainty had faded. Its ceremonies continued, its records expanded, yet its vision had dimmed. The organization that once promised eternal order had become an echo chamber repeating its own commandments. The empire endured in appearance, but its soul had begun to rust. When future generations studied this period, they found in the SS a paradox, an institution that sought to protect civilization by removing its humanity, that replaced morality with procedure and conscience with paperwork. It succeeded for a time, creating peace without mercy and stability without freedom. But in doing so, it built a world incapable of renewal. The SS Empire stood as both the pinnacle and the downfall of the new order, proof that control could preserve a civilization's body, but never its heart. Part 6. The Axis Triumvirate. By the late 1950s, the map of the world had settled into three great zones of power. Europe and the Western Hemisphere belonged to the Greater Germanic Reich, the Mediterranean and Africa to Italy's revived empire, and the Pacific and East Asia to the dominion of Japan. Together they formed the Axis Triumvirate, a partnership forged in war and held together by rivalry. Official propaganda described the triumvirate as a family of equals, a brotherhood of ancient civilizations guiding humanity into a new age. The truth was more complicated. Germany possessed the greatest industrial strength, Italy the oldest cultural prestige, and Japan the largest territory. Their cooperation was sustained not by trust, but by the mutual fear of isolation. Each empire ruled in its own image, and between them stretched a world divided by both geography and ambition. In Berlin, the Axis Council met twice a year. Delegates from Rome and Tokyo arrived by airship, descending onto the marble runways of the imperial capital. The ceremonies that followed were choreographed with precision, flags raised in sequence, orchestras blending the anthems of all three powers into a single measured harmony. Publicly, speeches celebrated unity. Privately, discussions revolved around trade quotas, resource access, and the delicate balance of military technology. Germany dominated the continental economy. Its factories in the Ruhr and Silesia produced machines, weapons, and vehicles for all members of the alliance. Italy supplied food and raw materials from its African colonies, while Japan controlled the Pacific's shipping routes and industrial resources. Together, they formed a closed economic circle, self-sufficient and formidable. Outside nations existed only on the periphery, trading under strict regulation, their independence nominal at best. The ideological cooperation was less stable. Germany promoted a doctrine of racial hierarchy centered on the supposed superiority of European civilization. Italy revived the imagery of Rome, proclaiming itself the guardian of Mediterranean culture. Japan preached its own form of destiny, rooted in emperor worship and the moral duty of expansion. For a time, these differences were masked by shared triumph, but as the world grew smaller, their contradictions became harder to ignore. In practice, the planet was divided along lines of language and skin. The German sphere encompassed Europe, North Africa, and the Americas. The Italian sphere stretched through the Mediterranean basin into Central Africa, and the Japanese sphere extended from India to the Pacific Islands. Each claimed to bring order and progress to its subjects, and each built its authority upon the suppression of those it ruled. In Europe, citizens of the Reich lived lives of mechanical comfort. Electricity, transport, and healthcare functioned flawlessly. Housing was uniform but well maintained. Work was steady, leisure organized. The cost was invisible, a society stripped of spontaneity and weighed down by silent conformity. People no longer dreamed beyond their roles. The SS monitored their habits, and the state provided everything else. In Italy's territories, the atmosphere was looser but equally controlled. Rome filled its boulevards with marble and banners, invoking the memory of Caesars long gone. Mussolini's successors styled themselves as philosopher kings, blending fascism with classical grandeur. The Mediterranean became a theater of ritual parades and festivals celebrating empire. Africa, meanwhile, existed as the source of labor and wealth. Its cities rebuilt in Roman style, its people subjected to racial laws modeled after Berlin's. Italian propaganda spoke of partnership. The reality was paternalism enforced by steel. Japan's empire followed its own path. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere stretched from China to Indonesia, encompassing hundreds of millions of subjects. Tokyo ruled through local administrations, rewarding collaboration and crushing dissent. The Japanese military became both ruler and religion, its officers worshipped as guardians of the emperor's divine mission. Cities like Seoul, Nanjing, and Manila glowed with industrial development, yet beneath the neon light lingered fear. Work was compulsory, speech controlled, and loyalty tested through constant surveillance. For ordinary people across this divided world, daily existence depended on where they stood within the hierarchy. A German engineer in Frankfurt might live a life of comfort, surrounded by modern conveniences and endless propaganda. A farmer in the Ukrainian colonies would rise before dawn to meet quotas set by distant bureaucrats. An African laborer under Italian supervision might toil in a plantation named after an emperor, receiving food and housing but no citizenship. A Chinese clerk in Shanghai could find pride in the empire's progress, yet know that every word he spoke might be overheard. The triumvirate's governments cooperated through necessity, not affection. Germany required Japanese access to Pacific resources, rubber, oil, and metals that its European territories lacked. Japan relied on German technology and Italian shipping infrastructure. Italy balanced between them, offering cultural legitimacy and acting as mediator when disputes threatened to rupture the alliance. Tensions grew most visibly in the realm of science. Each empire pursued its own projects in energy, aeronautics, and weaponry. Germany led in rocketry and atomic research, Japan dominated naval and aerospace industries, Italy specialized in architecture and social engineering. They exchanged discoveries selectively, guarding secrets as a form of currency. The fear that one might outpace the others kept cooperation intact, but brittle. Culturally, the triumvirate staged grand exhibitions to display harmony. Every decade brought a world congress of civilization, rotating between Berlin, Rome, and Tokyo. Visitors saw pavilions filled with art, technology, and models of future cities. They were told that humanity had reached maturity, guided by the wisdom of its three great empires. What the exhibitions never showed were the borders, checkpoints, and surveillance stations that kept this order intact. Religion was tolerated only when it served the state. Germany continued to promote its civic faith of destiny and blood. Italy reinterpreted Catholic symbolism to glorify the empire. Japan merged Shuto tradition with political loyalty. Across continents, millions bowed to different gods who all spoke the same command: obedience. Education mirrored these divisions. German schools trained administrators for Europe and Africa. Italian academies taught the art of governance through culture. Japanese universities prepared scientists and officers to extend their empire eastward. Exchange programs existed but served propaganda more than learning. Students returned home praising friendship between nations, unaware that they had witnessed only curated harmony. Despite the apparent stability, the alliance contained deep fractures. In the border zones where German and Japanese interests met, Central Asia and Siberia, competition for influence grew intense. Railways from Moscow and Tokyo converged on contested territories rich in minerals. Both powers built research cities along the frontier, each claiming to pioneer the future. Diplomats spoke of cooperation, but soldiers trained for contingency. The world that had once feared world war now lived inside a permanent cold one. Ordinary people felt this tension in subtler ways. Propaganda shifted tone, celebrating unity in public but emphasizing vigilance in private. Newsreels praised allies while quietly boasting of national superiority. Children learned songs honoring the triumvirate, yet each verse placed their own nation first. The promise of eternal peace began to sound rehearsed, the enthusiasm brittle. In the colonies of Africa and Asia, resentment simmered. Underneath the surface of imposed order, local populations developed underground cultures of resistance. Music, art, and oral stories preserved older identities. Markets carried goods banned by the authorities, and secret gatherings kept forbidden languages alive. The empires controlled territory, but never imagination. By the 1970s, the triumvirate reached its zenith. Its combined territories spanned nearly all inhabited continents. Airships bearing the three emblems, Eagle, Basses, and Rising Sun, circled the globe. The world's infrastructure reflected Axis design: identical airports, standardized currency, synchronized calendars. To the citizens within, this uniformity felt eternal. To those who still remembered another time, it felt like the world had been reduced to a single script written in 3 languages. Yet beneath the triumph, the alliance began to decay. Economies strained under over-centralization. Scientific rivalry outpaced coordination. The population, though obedient, began to lose faith in ideals that no longer inspired. Each empire faced the same paradox. It had conquered everything except the human desire for meaning. In Germany, younger citizens quietly questioned the endless emphasis on purity. In Italy, artists began to smuggle color and abstraction back into their paintings. In Japan, intellectuals debated the moral cost of perfection in essays circulated in secret. These were not revolutions, but tremors of fatigue spreading through a world built on discipline. By the end of the century, the Axis Triumvirate still ruled the earth, but its unity existed mostly on paper. Diplomats continued to meet, parades still filled city squares, and speeches praised eternal friendship. Yet everyone understood that the alliance had become an old machine running on habit. The 3 empires had achieved peace, but peace without purpose. Historians would later write that the triumvirate's greatest success was also its greatest failure. It had ended global conflict by freezing the world in place. Progress became maintenance, ambition became ritual. The eagle, The Faces and the rising sun each stood proud on their flags, but behind them stretched a planet grown weary of perfection. In that stillness, the human spirit began to stir again, faintly and invisibly, as it always does when systems overreach. The Triumvirate endured in name, but its future belonged to those who still remembered what it meant to choose. Part 7. America Isolated. When the Atlantic fell to Axis control, the oceans that had once protected the United States became walls instead of bridges. The war ended without invasion, yet defeat arrived all the same, through diplomacy, exhaustion, and the slow realization that the world beyond its borders no longer needed its participation. By the late 1940s, America had withdrawn into itself, a continental fortress surrounded by hostile empires and haunted by its own uncertainty. At first, isolation was framed as choice. The government announced a policy of continental consolidation, promising stability after years of war. The rhetoric was patriotic and soothing. Citizens were told that America would rebuild, recover, and remain free while Europe and Asia devoured themselves in tyranny. Few admitted that victory had never come. The old allies were gone, communication cables cut, trade routes seized. The once global republic found itself trapped inside its own geography. In the early years, life seemed to improve. The economy revived under massive state programs for reconstruction. Highways expanded, factories reopened, and unemployment vanished. Yet this new prosperity came at a cost. To maintain security in a divided world, Washington centralized authority. Emergency powers declared during wartime were never lifted. Newspapers remained cautious, radios patriotic, universities obedient. The United States, once a beacon of democratic debate, began to resemble the systems it feared. The political structure evolved quietly. Presidents served longer terms under the pretext of continuity. Congress still met, but most decisions passed by decree through national security committees. The Supreme Court, reluctant to challenge wartime laws, accepted permanent restrictions on speech and movement. The Constitution remained, but its spirit thinned. Citizens called it paper freedom. The cultural tone of the 1950s was one of cautious pride. Propaganda celebrated American independence, contrasting it with the regimentation of the Axis world. Films and newsreels depicted Europe as gray and mechanical, Asia as enslaved under ritual. America, by contrast, was portrayed as vibrant, moral, and chosen. Yet behind this brightness lay fear, the fear of infiltration, contamination, and ideological decay. The government built networks of internal surveillance modeled on the very systems it condemned abroad. Loyalty boards investigated teachers, artists, and civil servants. To question isolation was to risk accusation. Education shifted accordingly. Textbooks emphasized national self-reliance and warned against foreign philosophies. Children recited pledges describing the country as the last light of freedom. Geography lessons no longer depicted Europe or Asia in detail. Maps stopped at the coastlines. Generations grew up knowing the world only through suspicion. The oceans became psychological borders as much as physical ones. In everyday life, material comfort masked unease. Technology advanced rapidly. Television spread to every home, highways linked cities, and suburbs multiplied across the landscape. Consumer abundance replaced civic engagement. The motto of the era was simple: prosperity equals peace. But beneath the polished advertisements, loneliness grew. Travel abroad was forbidden except for official delegations, and immigration ceased entirely. The United States became a continent adrift, self-sufficient yet detached from the rhythm of history. Religion adapted to the mood. Churches filled again, preaching messages of endurance and destiny. Sermons described the nation as a chosen refuge, preserved by divine will while the rest of the world surrendered to darkness. For many Americans, faith replaced contact. Salvation became national rather than personal. The combination of comfort and isolation created a sense of moral superiority that dulled curiosity about what lay beyond the horizon. By the 1960s, a generation had come of age that had never seen a foreign visitor or heard another language spoken in public. The country's self-image hardened. Universities produced scientists and engineers, but fewer historians or philosophers. Cultural exchange existed only within tightly controlled exhibitions. Art celebrated the family, the home, and the flag, subjects safe from politics. Musicians who looked outward found little audience. The radio preferred optimism. Still, unease lingered. Along the coastal cities, ships occasionally sighted Axis vessels beyond international waters, Italian merchant fleets in the Atlantic, Japanese patrols in the Pacific. The encounters were brief and distant, but they fed rumor and fear. Newspapers called it the silent blockade. Trade depended entirely on the Western Hemisphere. Latin America supplied raw materials in exchange for manufactured goods, but the balance grew fragile. The empire to the south, nominally independent yet economically tied, began to resent its dependence. The promise of hemispheric unity faded into quiet competition. In Washington, the National Security Bureau replaced the old Department of State. Diplomats became analysts, reading Axis broadcasts for hints of threat. Intelligence agencies expanded into domestic life, justifying surveillance as patriotism. Citizens accepted it as the price of safety. Television news repeated slogans about vigilance and virtue, while public campaigns warned against defeatism, a word that came to mean any nostalgia for cooperation or debate. Rural America remained stable, even content. Farmers benefited from government price controls and guaranteed markets. Small towns thrived on self-sufficiency, proud of their insulation from global turmoil. Yet in the cities, restlessness grew. Artists, intellectuals, and veterans felt trapped in a society that praised freedom but feared expression. Some fled inland to live quietly. Others formed circles that met in basements to discuss forbidden ideas, internationalism, democracy, memory. These gatherings were small, but they represented the last flicker of the country's earlier pluralism. By the 1970s, the regime of isolation had matured into ideology. The United States called itself the Continental Republic, emphasizing permanence and stability. Elections continued, though candidates belonged to the same approved party. The flag gained a new star to symbolize unity across all 50 states, yet the unity it celebrated was enforced. The media described the outside world as unstable, barbaric, or corrupt. The few photographs that appeared in newspapers showed Axis parades or ruins, never ordinary people. The result was a collective blindness maintained through comfort. In technology, America continued to excel. Computers, satellites, and automation turned the continent into a fortress of innovation. Yet even science served the narrative of isolation. Space exploration became a purely symbolic project, missions to orbit and return, never to cooperate. The stars themselves were claimed as proof that destiny favored the Republic alone. Among ordinary citizens, life retained a rhythm of order. Work weeks shortened, wages rose, and leisure became a national pastime. Theme parks replaced town halls as gathering places. Holidays celebrated history simplified to myth, the founding fathers as saints, independence as eternity. Most Americans did not feel oppressed, they felt protected. The silence of isolation had become the background noise of existence. Still, traces of doubt persisted. Along the northern border, radio enthusiasts occasionally intercepted faint foreign broadcasts, music from Canada, speeches from Axis Europe, fragments of languages long unheard. Those who listened described the experience as both thrilling and painful, a reminder that the world continued beyond the walls. The government called these signals dangerous illusions, but they spread nonetheless, whispered from one listener to another. Cultural fatigue followed prosperity. The younger generation, raised in comfort but starved of contact, began to question the meaning of freedom without exchange. Writers rediscovered banned works from the past, reprinting them through underground presses. Painters experimented with abstraction again. Small demonstrations appeared on university campuses, calling not for revolution but for conversation with the world. The state responded with tolerance first, then with quiet intimidation. The rest of the planet watched America's solitude with curiosity and apprehension. The German Reich regarded it as a sleeping giant, powerful yet irrelevant. Italy admired its order but mocked its lack of culture. Japan viewed it as potential partner and future competitor. None saw it as a threat. The Atlantic and Pacific, once highways of trade, had become moats. The republic behind them had turned inward so completely that it no longer understood itself. By the century's end, the United States remained prosperous, peaceful, and alone. Its citizens lived long lives under bright skies, surrounded by technology and memory. Children played in clean streets, unaware that their grandparents had once feared foreign occupation and dreamed of global unity. The newspapers still printed the same headlines each Independence Day. America stands alone, strong, and free. Historians of the future would describe this era as a paradox. The nation had preserved its independence but lost its openness. It had defended liberty by limiting it, maintained peace by surrendering curiosity. Isolation had become identity. The last democracy of the old world survived, but only as a mirror image of the empires it once opposed, orderly, prosperous, and silent. In the end, America's greatest victory was also its quietest failure. It had proven that freedom cannot survive without connection, that walls built for safety eventually become prisons. Behind those walls, life continued, calm, comfortable, and unchallenged, but the sound of the ocean beyond them had faded into myth. Part 8. The Southern Hemisphere. When the smoke cleared above Europe and Asia, the rest of the world lay open to the new empires. The Axis victory had not only redrawn borders, it had redrawn the hierarchy of civilization itself. To the south stretched continents seen by Berlin, Rome, and Tokyo as extensions of their destiny, a vast resource frontier to sustain their peace. Africa, South America, and the Middle East became laboratories for control and symbols of imperial order. The official justification was progress. The propaganda ministries of all three powers described the Southern Hemisphere as a partnership of development. The language was polished, promising modern industry, agriculture, and education. In reality, the system was designed to serve the metropoles. Europe and East Asia consumed while the South provided. Africa. For Germany and Italy, Africa represented both memory and opportunity. The loss of old colonies after the First World War had long been a wound. Victory allowed the wound to be rewritten. Under joint administration, the continent was divided into spheres, Italy ruling the north and east from Libya to Somalia, Germany controlling the center and south from the Congo Basin to Namibia. The project was called Mittel Africa, the Central African Federation, though the word federation masked its nature. Railways and mining towns appeared first. German planners, trained in the methods of the Eastern Colonies, built straight roads across jungle and desert, linking extraction sites to ports on the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Italian engineers designed monumental coastal cities, porticos, arches, and white marble that glared under the sun. They were meant to symbolize civilization brought to the tropics. Behind the architecture stood the familiar machinery of exploitation. The African population was classified by labor category. Skilled workers received housing in regimented settlements near factories. Farmers joined collective plantations under European supervision. Rural life changed most. Traditional villages were relocated closer to roads and administrative centers. Local leaders were replaced by appointed governors fluent in the occupiers' languages. Education emphasized obedience and hygiene rather than history. Every region developed its own rhythm of survival. In the highlands of Kenya and Tanganyika, people continued to farm quietly, keeping ancestral customs in private. Along the Niger and Congo, underground markets thrived at night, trading food and information beyond the empire's reach. The official reports called these informal economies, but they were also networks of endurance, a quiet resistance expressed through persistence. The Italian administration promoted a softer face of empire. It opened hospitals and schools, organized athletic festivals, and encouraged selected Africans to study in Rome. Propaganda films showed smiling students waving tricolor flags, symbols of partnership. Yet all advancement remained conditional. Citizenship was rare, and education stopped where it threatened hierarchy. The motto of the African Directorate, order, labor, faith, appeared on every public building. Germany's rule was colder, more systematic. Agricultural zones run by settlers supplied grain and cotton to Europe. The continent became an industrial hinterland for the Reich. Cities such as Windhoek and Leopoldville were transformed into model German towns, broad avenues, clock towers, and quiet discipline. Beyond their perimeters, vast rural districts functioned under labor directives that treated people as part of the harvest itself. The empire measured success in tons and quotas, not lives. Despite this, traces of culture endured. Musicians adapted European instruments to local scales. Storytellers wove parables about endurance disguised as folk tales approved by the authorities. Even in the most ordered cities, markets hummed with songs in forbidden dialects. Empire could regulate work, but not rhythm. The Middle East. Between Africa and Asia stretched the corridor of oil, the resource that powered every machine of the New World. After victory, the Reich moved swiftly to control it. The Middle East became a chain of protectorates administered through local monarchies and military advisors. German engineers managed refineries in Iraq and Persia, while Italian corporations supervised construction along the Mediterranean coast. The region's ancient cities, Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, underwent transformation. Streets widened, monuments restored, and government buildings rose in neoclassical style. The propaganda spoke of rejuvenation, of empire breathing new life into the cradle of civilization. Beneath the surface, political independence vanished. Economic councils in Berlin and Rome dictated production levels, trade routes, and population movements. Religion presented a challenge to ideological unity. Islam, Christianity, and Judaism had deep roots that could not be erased. The occupiers responded with cautious manipulation rather than suppression. Clerics who supported stability received patronage. Those who resisted disappeared from public life. Textbooks reinterpreted scripture to praise discipline and obedience. Faith survived, but its language was bent toward loyalty. Daily life alternated between prosperity and control. Oil wealth funded infrastructure, roads, electricity, hospitals, but access was uneven. In rural villages, traditions persisted much as before. In cities, a new cosmopolitan elite emerged fluent in German or Italian, trading loyalty for privilege. The empire's message was clear. Cooperation brought progress, dissent brought silence. Cultural identity retreated into art. Poets and painters adopted symbolism, speaking of rivers and winds instead of politics. In the markets of Cairo and Tehran, whispered verses carried double meanings. Even in a world of censorship, metaphor found a way to breathe. South America. While Africa and the Middle East fell directly under Axis administration, South America entered the new order through alignment. Argentina, Brazil, and Chile had long histories of authoritarianism and European influence. Under the post-war balance, they drifted naturally toward the Reich. German and Italian advisors reorganized their economies, and within a decade the southern continent had become the third pillar of the Axis world economy. Buenos Aires became the informal capital of Latin fascism, a city of grand boulevards, zeppelins, and steel-framed skyscrapers. German corporations invested heavily in agriculture and aviation, while Italian architects reshaped the skyline with marble and symmetry. Propaganda declared a Latin-Aryan partnership, claiming shared heritage through Southern European ancestry. In practice, the partnership reinforced dependence. South America exported meat, coffee, and minerals to Europe and imported finished goods in return. Its factories served the Reich's supply chains. Political opposition faded under the watch of security councils trained in Berlin. The continent's old dreams of independence survived only in literature smuggled from one university to another. Brazil presented the most complex picture. Its vast territory and mixed population defied easy control. The regime promoted nationalism and racial hierarchy simultaneously, encouraging European immigration while segregating indigenous and African-descended communities. Large-scale infrastructure projects, the Trans-Amazonian Highway, hydroelectric dams, and model cities, symbolized progress, yet displaced millions. Official reports celebrated these as triumphs of civilization. Local memories recorded them as losses too deep for statistics. Across the continent, society split in two. Urban elites enjoyed modernity, cinemas, automobiles, and radio stations broadcasting Axis news in Portuguese and Spanish. Rural populations lived under labor quotas and debt peonage reminiscent of older colonial systems. Some fled into the interior, forming hidden communities that mixed old and new traditions, surviving beyond the reach of government patrols. Despite heavy censorship, culture remained vibrant. Tango and samba evolved into subtle commentaries on control and longing. Painters mixed European technique with indigenous symbols, producing art that looked compliant but carried echoes of rebellion. Historians would later note that in these quiet acts of beauty lay the first cracks in the empire's global facade. The global balance. By the 1970s, the Southern Hemisphere had become indispensable to the Axis world. Its minerals fed the factories of Europe and Japan. Its crops filled northern markets. Its oil kept the empire's machines running. Official atlases labeled it the resource continent, colored in gold on every map. In propaganda films, smiling farmers harvested under banners of unity. Ships departed from modern ports, and the narrator promised that humanity had finally mastered nature. The reality was more fragile. The very abundance that sustained the empires also exposed their contradictions. Infrastructure stretched thin, ecological damage increased, resentment simmered beneath the surface. The South provided wealth, but received little voice. Its people lived between gratitude and grief, grateful for stability, grieving for autonomy. Occasionally, the silence broke. Strikes erupted in African mines, protests in Argentine universities, uprisings in Middle Eastern oil towns. The responses were swift and administrative: curfews, reorganizations, new governors. Yet each incident left a trace, a whisper that control could not erase. The Southern Hemisphere stood as both triumph and warning. It embodied the efficiency of the Axis world and its moral emptiness, the illusion of order achieved through distance. The North consumed, the South endured. Together they formed a globe balanced on inequality so normalized that most citizens no longer saw it. When historians of the future wrote about this age, They described it as the moment when humanity learned to live without empathy. Technology and architecture advanced, economies flourished, and cities glittered under electric suns. Yet in the quiet places, on farms at dusk, in desert villages, in jungle clearings, people still looked to the horizon and wondered what freedom had once felt like. Part 9: The Vanishing Peoples. When the New World map was finally printed, it seemed complete. Every border was straight, every province named, every population counted. To those who ruled, it appeared that the chaos of the old centuries had been resolved. Yet what the maps did not show were the absences, the people, languages, and histories quietly removed to make room for perfection. The empire had mastered the art of disappearance. Its architects spoke of harmonization. It was a word meant to sound benevolent, suggesting music and balance. In practice, it meant the steady removal of those who did not fit the imperial model. The process was bureaucratic, deliberate, and wrapped in paper rather than smoke. Files replaced battles, forms replaced bullets. To the citizens who benefited, it looked like progress. To those who vanished, it looked like erasure wearing the mask of order. Across Europe, entire communities that once defined its diversity faded into anonymity. In the cities of the Reich, neighborhoods once alive with multiple languages were repopulated with uniformed citizens. Synagogues, mosques, and small parish churches stood empty or repurposed as archives. Their stones remained, but their meaning was gone. In public memory, they became relics of a less disciplined past. The state justified these transformations as necessary for unity. Official documents recorded every transfer, every relocation, every reclassification. The records contained no hatred, only procedure. Citizens who once belonged to minority groups found their names quietly changed in registries, their heritage redefined as regional. The empire did not always destroy difference, it absorbed it, filed it away, and pretended it had never existed. In the Eastern Colonies, the policy took the form of integration. Children from surviving local populations were placed in German-run schools where they were taught the language of the empire and the virtues of obedience. Generations grew up unable to speak the words of their grandparents. Folklore, songs, and dialects that had carried through centuries of hardship disappeared within decades. To the administrators, this was success, a generation finally free from the burden of ancestry. The cultural cleansing extended far beyond language. Libraries reorganized their catalogs, removing authors who celebrated diversity or dissent. Museums reframed their exhibits to present history as a steady climb toward order. The art of conquered peoples was described as primitive inspiration, displayed without context, stripped of origin. Visitors admired the craftsmanship while forgetting the people who had made it. In Africa and the Middle East, the same policy unfolded through economic control rather than direct repression. Traditional guilds and spiritual schools were replaced by technical institutes modeled on European standards. Crafts that once carried symbolic meaning were mass-produced for export. Dances and rituals became tourist performances for visiting officials. A continent that had once contained thousands of cultures began to speak in the voice of its administrators. South America underwent what officials called racial synthesis. Propaganda celebrated a new Latin civilization uniting European discipline with tropical vitality. In reality, it meant gradual whitening, education, marriage laws, and urban planning designed to dilute indigenous presence. Old neighborhoods were demolished to build boulevards modeled after Berlin and Rome. Monuments to local heroes were quietly removed or rededicated to abstract ideals like labor and unity. Everywhere, the pattern was the same. The empire sought not only to rule but to simplify, to reduce the human landscape until it reflected a single image of perfection. The disappearance of peoples was not treated as tragedy but as efficiency. Maps grew cleaner, charts more legible. Diversity, once the mark of a living world, became an administrative inconvenience. For those who remained on the margins, survival required invisibility. Families changed names and professions, blending into the uniform society around them. In private, they preserved fragments of memory, recipes, songs, proverbs, small acts of defiance whispered behind closed doors. Some communities moved into remote regions, continuing their traditions out of sight. In the Empire's reports, these groups were described as unclassified, a term that turned endurance into anomaly. Religion persisted in hidden corners. In the ruins of old churches and temples, candles still burned, their light unseen from the streets. Pilgrimages continued in disguise as official holidays. Prayers were recited under new names. The Empire tolerated faith as long as it remained invisible. What it feared was not belief, but remembrance, the idea that history could exist outside its control. The cultural disappearance of minorities created a strange emptiness within the Empire's heart. Cities grew larger and quieter, filled with people who looked similar and thought alike. Music lost its dissonance, art lost its edge. The same songs echoed from one end of the continent to the other, perfect and interchangeable. What had once been a chorus of many voices became a single hum of conformity. A few scholars noticed the cost. In the 1970s, under the protection of anonymity, they began to compile unofficial histories, catalogs of vanished dialects, censored books, and unrecorded names. These works circulated secretly, passed from hand to hand on carbon copies. Their authors called themselves archivists of silence. They wrote not to accuse, but to remember, preserving fragments of a humanity the Empire had declared obsolete. Their notes described curious patterns. In regions where communities had been erased, people reported dreams of strangers speaking unknown tongues. Folklore reappeared in children's games without origin, melodies hummed by those who had never heard them. Memory, it seemed, resisted extinction. It returned quietly through imagination. By the end of the century, the Empire faced a paradox of its own creation. It had achieved stability and uniformity beyond precedent, yet it was haunted by absence. Tourists visiting restored medieval towns spoke of beauty but sensed something missing, a warmth, a noise, a trace of unpredictability. The air felt too clean, the streets too wide. The Empire had perfected civilization to the point of sterility. Historians of the next stage would call this era the century of forgetting. They would note that the disappearance of peoples did not happen through catastrophe but through paperwork and silence. Cultures rarely died in flames. They faded in offices where names were misspelled and histories rewritten. What vanished was not only humanity's diversity, but its capacity for empathy. And yet, within that silence, seeds of renewal remained. In remote mountain villages, storytellers began to reappear, claiming descent from forgotten tribes. In the ports of Africa and the Americas, musicians rediscovered rhythms thought extinct. Language scholars stumbled upon words preserved in private letters. The Empire's attempt to erase difference had in the long run preserved it, hidden, dormant, waiting for a gentler world to listen. In the final decades of the 20th century, the ruling elites still celebrated their harmonious order. Parades filled the capitals, orchestras played uniform anthems, and speeches praised a century without conflict. But beneath the sound of triumph lay another, quieter rhythm, the murmur of memory returning. The peoples who had been written out of history were beginning, faintly, to be remembered again. Part 10. The Children of the Reich. By the middle of the 20th century, a new generation had come of age under the shadow of order. They were the first who had never known the confusion of war or the arguments of democracy. Their parents remembered both, they did not. To them, the empire's peace was as natural as the sunrise, and its values as unquestionable as gravity. They were called the children of the Reich. From birth, each child belonged as much to the state as to their family. Hospitals recorded lineage, health, and aptitude. The information entered the central registry before a name was even chosen. Every infant carried a number that followed them from cradle to career. The process felt efficient rather than intrusive, an act of civic housekeeping rather than control. Parents accepted it as a symbol of civilization's progress. Early childhood revolved around structure. Nurseries were bright and immaculate, filled with identical toys designed to teach coordination and discipline. Walls displayed portraits of explorers, scientists, and idealized mothers, figures representing service and purity. Songs taught rhythm and order. Even playtime followed a schedule. The empire had discovered that obedience could be taught long before comprehension. When a child reached 6 years of age, they entered the national education system. Schools across the continent looked the same: long buildings of pale stone, windows aligned in geometric precision. Each morning began with a salute to the flag and a recitation of the oath of gratitude, thanking the state for peace and guidance. The words varied slightly by region, but carried the same promise: loyalty, diligence, and unity. Teachers were carefully selected. They were not merely educators but guardians of ideology, trained to recognize hesitation as weakness. Yet the atmosphere inside the classroom was calm, not severe. Lessons emphasized teamwork, neatness, and pride. Punishment was rare. Correction came through repetition. The system preferred self-regulation to fear. The curriculum balanced science, physical education, and moral instruction. History textbooks presented a world that had once been divided by chaos until the empire restored order. Geography lessons taught that the globe now formed one harmonious whole, guided by a enlightened authority. Art classes celebrated realism, portraits of workers, landscapes without shadow, designs inspired by machinery. Children learned to see beauty in precision and virtue in conformity. Outside the classroom, youth organizations filled every hour that school did not claim. Boys and girls alike joined civic brigades where they learned first aid, agriculture, and the basics of engineering. Uniforms differed by color but shared the same symbolism: duty before self. On weekends, they marched through city streets singing anthems that blended patriotism with optimism. These parades were less about militarism than belonging. They assured the young that they were part of something vast and eternal. Families, too, participated in the educational order. The Ministry of Culture provided parenting manuals advising on nutrition, bedtime routines, and moral guidance. The ideal household was clean, efficient, and content. Radios played approved stories at night, tales of discovery and loyalty, where curiosity always led back to service. The empire understood that the surest way to shape the future was to make obedience feel like love. As the children grew older, their schooling branched into categories determined by aptitude tests. Those with technical skill entered engineering institutes, others trained for administration, agriculture, or medicine. The most gifted were invited to elite academies run by the SS Directorate, where leadership was taught as both science and philosophy. There, students studied psychology, genetics, and history, learning to view society as an organism guided by the few for the benefit of the many. Higher education remained a privilege, but no one considered it unjust. The idea of equality had been replaced by the idea of function. Each person served a role within the machinery of the state, and happiness came from fulfilling that role perfectly. Students who did not advance to universities entered apprenticeships or community service programs. Work began early and continued seamlessly from education to employment, with no uncertain years in between. For these young citizens, patriotism was not fervent but serene. They did not wave flags in anger, they carried them in pride. They spoke of destiny without the vocabulary of conquest. To them, the empire's past atrocities were ancient history, vague and sanitized. The curriculum described the old wars as necessary steps toward unity. Evil had been redefined as disorder. Cultural expression among the youth reflected this tranquility. Music was structured around harmony and repetition. Lyrics celebrated collective achievement. Fashion was uniform, but elegant. Simple lines, muted colors, minimal individuality. Photographs from the period show smiling faces beneath identical haircuts, students standing in perfect rows. The visual sameness concealed inner difference, but for a time few seemed to mind. Still, beneath the surface, curiosity persisted. Children are natural questioners, and even in the most orderly world, they asked why. Teachers deflected, parents avoided, officials explained that the past was dangerous to discuss. The more forbidden it became, the more some students sought it. In the quiet corners of libraries, they discovered censored books misfiled by accident. In attics, they found boxes of old letters written before the reform of language. These artifacts hinted at a world larger and messier than the one they knew. By adolescence, subtle generational tension began to appear. The empire's first generation of citizens had accepted peace as salvation. Their children began to see it as confinement. The state responded with gentler propaganda, campaigns about creativity within discipline, individuality within loyalty. Educational films depicted innovators who questioned without rebelling, thinkers who discovered without doubting authority. The message was clear: curiosity was welcome, but only if it ended in affirmation. Youth festivals became central to public life. Each summer, millions gathered in massive stadiums for the Festival of Renewal, where choruses sang and athletes competed under the eyes of the leadership. The event symbolized harmony between body and state. Spectators described it as overwhelming beauty. Music, movement, and light orchestrated with mathematical precision. Yet among the applause, some felt an unease they could not name. Admiration without emotion, joy without spontaneity. By the 1970s, the first generation raised entirely under imperial education had entered adulthood. They were intelligent, disciplined, and remarkably polite. Crime was nearly non-existent, productivity unmatched. But art critics and psychologists noticed something missing: a dullness in expression, a reluctance to imagine the unknown. The human spirit had been trained to move in straight lines. A quiet rebellion began in thought rather than action. University students started to explore philosophy banned decades earlier, discovering words like freedom and doubt with the wonder of explorers. Painters experimented with abstraction again, their canvases filled with shapes that defied interpretation. Writers circulated stories that ended not with moral clarity, but with questions. These small gestures did not threaten the empire directly, but they signaled its fatigue. Parents, observing their children, felt both pride and distance. They had been taught to value obedience, their offspring valued meaning. The generational divide was not dramatic, but it widened each year. The empire had built perfect citizens. It had not foreseen that perfection would breed emptiness. Historians of this era later described the children of the Reich as both the empire's greatest achievement and its first true challenge. They were proof that ideology could shape a generation, but also that no system could extinguish the human need for wonder. Within their disciplined minds, questions were forming, questions that would one day reopen the silence their elders had accepted. Part 11. Science Without Soul. In the century that followed the Axis victory, science advanced more quickly than ever before. Laboratories glittered with glass and steel. Cities ran on flawless systems of energy and automation, and disease nearly vanished from daily life. The Empire called this progress proof of its destiny. But beneath the brilliance of discovery lay a darker foundation. Knowledge itself had been remade in the image of ideology. At the heart of the Empire's scientific doctrine stood a single belief, that not all human beings were equal in origin or potential. What had once been a fringe theory became law. Biology was rewritten to fit the myth of the Aryan race as the pinnacle of evolution. Textbooks spoke of hierarchies of vitality, of genetic lines destined for leadership and others for labor. This dogma shaped every discipline, from medicine to physics, from psychology to engineering, turning science from a search for truth into an instrument of social design. The universities of the Reich reflected this transformation. Each began its academic year with a ceremony honoring the purity of knowledge. Professors swore oaths not to truth, but to ideology. Research proposals were evaluated not only for merit, but for alignment with racial doctrine. Laboratories received funding based on how well their work served the state's goals: strength, control, and homogeneity. The field once known as biology split into two branches. The first studied heredity, focused entirely on classification and improvement of the so-called Aryan population. Scientists mapped genealogies, measuring skulls and eye color, convinced that destiny could be quantified. The second branch dealt with applied physiology, nutrition, exercise, and medicine aimed at producing the perfect citizen. Diseases that affected the favored classes were studied exhaustively, while those that afflicted the marginalized were quietly ignored. Public health programs became moral campaigns. Clinics offered care to the loyal and efficient, while others received only advice to improve their biological discipline. The Empire framed this as compassion, the strong uplifting the weak through guidance. But the hidden message was clear. Health had become a measure of worth. Illness implied inferiority. In engineering and industry, racial ideology expressed itself through aesthetics. Machines were designed with geometric purity, symmetrical, and cold. Architects built structures meant to embody strength and permanence, massive facades of concrete and marble that dwarfed the human form. Technology mirrored philosophy. Everything orderly, nothing unpredictable. Creativity that strayed from the approved style was labeled decadent. Even the physical sciences were not immune. Physicists who explored theories born outside the Empire's favored schools found their work dismissed as foreign mathematics. Collaborations across continents disappeared. Knowledge narrowed, brilliant within its chosen path, but blind to the wider universe. The Empire's greatest minds built rockets that could circle the Earth, but ignored the stars beyond ideology's horizon. Within universities, anthropology and psychology became tools of control. Scholars measured intelligence through tests designed to confirm pre-existing hierarchies. They described cultural difference as deficiency, presenting prejudice as data. Journals printed graphs and tables that transformed bias into authority. The scientific method remained intact in form: hypothesis, experiment, result. But its purpose had changed. It no longer sought to understand humanity, it sought to rank it. The moral cost of this transformation was hidden behind precision. Reports spoke in numbers and percentages, never in lives. When the Empire conducted population studies to plan settlements or education quotas, officials referred to people as units of potential. The language of bureaucracy sterilized empathy. Over time, even well-intentioned scientists forgot what their data represented. They became managers of statistics, not caretakers of truth. The cult of the Aryan ideal reached into every field. Art academies taught anatomy not to explore beauty, but to define it. Artists studied the proportions of the perfect body. their canvases filled with identical figures, healthy, expressionless, and serene. Medical students learned to treat such bodies as models for society. The sick and the old became reminders of imperfection, tolerated but hidden. Progress required the illusion that decline had been conquered. Outside the laboratories, the ideology of purity shaped everyday technology. Factories produced machines designed to serve efficiency, not comfort. Automobiles moved in silent lines, houses regulated air and temperature automatically, streets gleamed under perpetual light. The empire believed it had solved the unpredictability of nature. Yet the more perfect the systems became, the more detached from humanity they felt. Citizens lived surrounded by miracles of engineering, and yet sensed a quiet emptiness in their usefulness. Religion, once a source of moral restraint, had been reinterpreted to praise order. Clerics spoke of science as the hand of destiny. The creation story itself was rewritten in textbooks as an allegory of selection, the strong surviving to guide the weak. The language of faith and research fused into one philosophy, obedience to design. Over time, even the scientists themselves began to doubt what they had built. A few noticed inconsistencies in the empire's genetic theories. Data refused to align with ideology, variation persisted. Quietly, they began to record the differences as anomalies rather than errors, preserving evidence for a future that might value truth again. Others tried to reconcile ethics and order, writing essays about the human factor that circulated in restricted academic journals. Their caution revealed the limits of the system. Control could regulate action, but not conscience. By the 1970s, the empire's technological achievements filled museums of progress. Visitors marveled at synthetic crops that resisted disease, aircraft that circled the globe in hours, and machines that translated languages instantly. But the same visitors rarely asked who decided which languages were worth preserving or whose histories had been omitted from the exhibits. The perfection of presentation silenced inquiry. The global influence of the Reich science spread through the Triumvirate. Italian researchers adopted its architectural logic. Japanese institutes borrowed its emphasis on hierarchy. Together, they produced a unified scientific worldview, precise, efficient, and morally hollow. Knowledge became a shared language of control. To those born within this system, it seemed eternal. Students memorized formulas without context, recited definitions of race as if they were laws of physics, and trusted that progress was synonymous with virtue. The idea that science could exist without ideology felt absurd. Only a few remembered that inquiry had once been an act of curiosity, not obedience. Historians of later centuries would look back on this period as one of dazzling achievement and profound blindness. They would note that the empire reached technological heights unmatched in history, yet failed to understand the simplest truth, that discovery without compassion leads to emptiness. In its quest to prove superiority, it stripped knowledge of its soul. The laboratories of the Reich glowed through the night, their lights visible for miles across the silent cities. Inside, machines hummed and calculations filled chalkboards. Progress continued endlessly, indifferent to meaning. And outside, under the same stars the empire had claimed to understand, the forgotten people of the world still looked upward, seeing in that quiet sky a mystery that no ideology could measure. Part 12. The Machinery of Faith. In the new empire, faith did not vanish, it was redesigned. The rulers understood that religion, though ancient, could be as useful as any technology. Where older regimes had feared the power of belief, the Reich learned to harness it. It replaced salvation with obedience, transcendence with purpose, and called the result harmony. The transformation began quietly after Victory Day. Across Europe, churches reopened under new supervision. Bells rang again, but their sound now announced national holidays instead of holy ones. Crosses, stars, and crescents remained on walls, yet beside them hung the symbols of the state. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Loyalty to heaven and loyalty to empire had become the same duty. A new office emerged within the Ministry of Culture, the Bureau for Spiritual Affairs. Its task was to integrate all faiths into the moral framework of the empire. The Bureau did not abolish religion, it standardized it. Sermons were reviewed for tone, prayers edited for content, and scripture translated into the formal language of authority. Every faith retained its outward form, but its words now echoed the same refrain: discipline, unity, and gratitude for the order that ruled the world. Christianity was the easiest to reshape. State theologians reinterpreted it as a story of divine hierarchy, God as the architect of order, humanity as his obedient creation, and the empire as the earthly mirror of his design. The suffering of Christ became an allegory for sacrifice to duty. Mercy was replaced by merit. Churches filled again, their pews crowded with citizens seeking stability rather than forgiveness. The atmosphere was serene, yet hollow. In Catholic regions under Italian influence, the partnership between church and empire appeared almost natural. Rome's clergy found security in collaboration. Cathedrals were restored, festivals sponsored, schools funded. The price was silence. Homilies praised the moral clarity of the new age and the virtue of submission to righteous authority. Confession became less a ritual of conscience than a method of surveillance. Protestant lands followed with equal compliance. Sermons emphasized work as worship, order as faith. The individual soul, once the core of Protestant belief, was redefined as a cell within a greater organism. The language of grace gave way to the language of service. In the Middle East, the story unfolded differently. Islam was recognized as a stabilizing force and thus reinterpreted rather than replaced. Scholars loyal to the empire compiled a new commentary aligning divine law with imperial governance. Pilgrimage routes were protected, but only those who signed declarations of loyalty could travel. The empire presented this as respect for tradition, though it functioned as control disguised as reverence. Judaism survived only in fragments, hidden and redefined. Officially, the empire declared the Jewish question resolved. Unofficially, remnants of Jewish heritage persisted in the shadows. Families disguised prayers as songs, holidays as private meals. In a world that measured loyalty by visibility, invisibility became survival. Eastern religions under Japan's sphere followed a parallel path. Shinto and Buddhism merged into civic ceremonies honoring the emperor and the ancestors of the state. Temples gleamed with new architecture, clean lines, concrete instead of wood, banners of empire fluttering beside sacred gates. Meditation became a tool for productivity, detachment, a virtue of discipline. Spirituality was measured by efficiency. Across the Triumvirate, this pattern repeated, the sacred redefined as useful, faith mechanized. The empire did not abolish God, it nationalized him. Education reinforced the new theology from childhood. Schoolbooks described faith as the emotional counterpart to science, the means by which citizens could find peace in the certainty of design. Children learned simplified prayers that thanked both divine creation and human order in the same breath. Religious instruction emphasized obedience, not revelation. The line between worship and ceremony disappeared. The architecture of worship reflected the shift. New temples, cathedrals, and shrines rose in every capital, grand structures of stone and steel illuminated by electric halos. Their interiors were minimalist, stripped of mystery. Stained glass was replaced by murals of workers and soldiers standing beneath rays of light descending from stylized suns. Services followed a universal format: music, pledge, reflection, instruction. Emotion was allowed only in measured doses, never enough to ignite dissent. Yet belief, even when regimented, remained unpredictable. Ordinary people continued to pray for personal reasons, for health, for love, for forgiveness. Many still whispered the old words before sleeping, even if they could not speak them aloud in public. The Empire's greatest success lay not in eradicating faith, but in making people unsure whether their faith was their own. Within monasteries and seminaries, quiet resistance grew. Some monks preserved original scriptures, hiding them within false walls or encoding them in illuminated manuscripts that appeared purely decorative. A few priests and imams taught students to read between the lines of state-approved texts, reminding them that truth could not be owned. They spoke in parables about light trapped in glass, unchanged, only refracted. Outside the official institutions, new movements appeared. Urban intellectuals created philosophies of order, blending spirituality with psychology. They spoke of the divine as symmetry, of sin as imbalance, of redemption as alignment with the Empire's rhythm. To the authorities, these ideas seemed harmless, even flattering. Yet beneath their polished language lay a quiet hunger for meaning that the system could not provide. Art began to express what faith could not say openly. Painters depicted endless corridors of light, suggesting a search for something beyond architecture. Composers wrote music that began with perfect harmony but ended unresolved, as if yearning for imperfection. Audiences found these works strangely moving, though few could explain why. It was the sound of belief rediscovering doubt. By the 1970s, the machinery of faith had achieved its purpose. Religion no longer threatened authority, it reinforced it. Every nation celebrated the same sacred calendar of civic holidays. Pilgrimages converged on capitals instead of holy sites. Prayer had become patriotism a form of prayer. But beneath the calm surface, fatigue spread among clergy and citizens alike. The absence of genuine mystery left a quiet void. Temples were full, yet the air inside them felt thin. The faithful followed rituals without conviction, comforted more by routine than by revelation. Historians of the future would call this the era of reverent apathy. In remote villages, however, something different survived. Farmers still blessed their fields in the old way. Families lit candles at ancestral graves without official permission. Children asked their grandparents why the stars seemed to whisper when the lights of the Empire went out. The old answers returned softly, carried by memory rather than doctrine. When the Empire's final century approached, its rulers had perfected the structure of belief, but lost its substance. They could orchestrate devotion, but not inspire it. The machinery of faith continued to turn, efficient, polished, and empty, while beneath its hum, the human spirit waited for the courage to pray again without permission. Part 13. The Global Order. By the closing decades of the 20th century, the Empire had achieved what its founders once called the final equilibrium. The world appeared stable, organized, and endlessly efficient. Trains ran on time across continents, crops were harvested by schedule, and no war had been recorded for half a century. To those who ruled, it was proof that history itself had been mastered. To those who lived within it, it was a hierarchy so complete that it felt like nature itself. The foundation of this order was a caste system, an unspoken yet universally understood ladder of worth. Officially, the Empire rejected the term. It preferred classification by function. But everyone knew the structure that governed their lives. At its summit stood the high Aryan families, descendants of the original conquerors, bearers of the state's mythology. Below them came the certified citizens, still of European descent but ranked by education, ancestry, and loyalty. Beneath these tiers lived the auxiliary classes, workers, technicians, and farmers drawn from populations deemed assimilated but lesser. At the very bottom were the global subjects, the millions outside the legal definition of citizenship, whose labor and obedience sustained the peace they could never share. The mechanism of hierarchy was paperwork. Every citizen possessed an identification card embossed with a numeric code that revealed ancestry, region, and social category. Promotions or demotions in status occurred through periodic evaluations recorded by the Bureau of Population Integrity. The process resembled corporate management more than governance, cold, procedural, and impersonal. Officials spoke of upgrading or reassigning lives as if they were adjusting machinery. Within the Aryan upper strata, society functioned with ritual precision. Families traced genealogy back to the founding generation. Marriages were arranged through registries that compared bloodlines and temperament scores. Children born of these unions entered elite schools and were groomed for leadership. Their world was one of marble corridors, clean uniforms, and endless ceremony. Yet even here, the hierarchy fractured. Those of purest ancestry regarded the rest as a necessary dilution, and whispers of lineage could elevate or end careers. What had once been an ideology had hardened into social physics, inevitable, immutable, and quietly corrosive. For the certified citizens, the vast middle of the empire, life was orderly but constrained. They enjoyed security, healthcare, and education, yet advancement required flawless conformity. Ancestral background set the ceiling for ambition. A family could serve the state with perfect loyalty for generations, and still find its progress halted by a statistic printed generations earlier. Most accepted the limitation as natural law. It was said that a citizen's place in the hierarchy was like the orbit of a planet, stable, predictable, and eternal. Below them, the auxiliary classes formed the empire's workforce. Drawn from colonized regions and mixed heritages, they built the cities, harvested the fields, and maintained the infrastructure. They received housing, rations, and the promise of peace, but not citizenship. Their identification cards bore a different color, marking them as temporary residents, though the status passed from parent to child. They were allowed to travel only with permits and required to renew them each year. In official language, they were contributors to civilization. In private speech, they were ghosts with jobs. The surveillance network kept the hierarchy intact. Every home, school, and workplace contained monitoring devices linked to the central authority grid. Officially, these ensured efficiency and safety. In truth, they preserved the caste structure through constant observation. Citizens learned to moderate their expressions, to speak in approved idioms, to praise stability as naturally as breathing. Dissent rarely needed to be punished, it simply ceased to appear. Across the global territories, racial distinction shaped every aspect of existence. In the African and Middle Eastern provinces, local populations lived in regimented settlements organized by occupation. Travel between districts required authorization. Mixed communities were discouraged. Education focused on basic literacy and vocational skills, avoiding history or philosophy. The empire justified these limitations as pragmatic. Each race contributes according to its nature. The phrase appeared on posters and textbooks, even in medical pamphlets. Economics reinforced ideology. Industries that required precision, aviation, engineering, scientific research, remained closed to non-Aryans. Agriculture, mining, and construction absorbed the rest. Wages differed by classification, rations by loyalty record. On paper, inequality was rationalized as functional specialization. In reality, it ensured that prosperity flowed upward and dependence downward. Propaganda softened the harsh edges of this structure. Newsreels depicted smiling workers of every background cooperating for the good of the whole. Radio dramas told stories of humble farmers rewarded with promotion for diligence, fiction designed to keep hope alive. The empire understood that even in a system of hierarchy, the illusion of mobility was essential. Once a decade, a few exceptional individuals from the lower classes were elevated publicly as proof that the ladder could be climbed. Their faces appeared on posters, their names celebrated, and then the system closed again around them. Religion and science worked together to legitimize hierarchy. The machinery of faith preached that every soul had been designed for its station, that obedience maintained cosmic balance. Meanwhile, pseudogenetic research continued to classify populations according to heritage coefficients, providing the numbers that justified inequality. Universities produced endless papers proving what the regime already believed. Within the colonies, resistance adapted to survive. Open defiance was impossible, but culture persisted in quiet forms. Songs carried coded references to forbidden histories, folk tales disguised subversion as morality. Markets after sunset became spaces of exchange not just for goods but for memory. The empire's officials recorded none of it, dismissing such acts as folklore. Yet in these fragments lay the memory of freedom. The caste structure shaped even personal relationships. Friendships between classes were discouraged, marriages strictly regulated. In cities where populations mixed for work, invisible boundaries separated neighborhoods. Parks, schools, and restaurants existed in duplicate, identical in design but divided by access level. The architecture itself became a map of inequality, marble for the citizen, concrete for the subject. By the 1970s, the system seemed invincible. Surveillance prevented rebellion, propaganda prevented despair, and bureaucracy prevented change. But beneath the calm, fatigue spread. Among the lower classes, generations born into subservience began to question whether the empire's peace was worth the silence it required. Among the upper classes, decadence replaced discipline. Privilege bred stagnation, ideology turned ceremonial. A few voices within the academic world began to challenge the orthodoxy. Economists warned that stratification stifled innovation. Sociologists whispered that loyalty enforced by ancestry could not last forever. Their arguments circulated cautiously, couched in technical language to avoid suspicion. But even muted, they revealed the first intellectual cracks in the facade of perfection. Ordinary citizens noticed subtler changes. Rumors spread of small uprisings in remote colonies, of data leaks exposing falsified census records, of officials quietly questioning the purity laws. The state dismissed these as anomalies, yet unease rippled through society. People began to sense that the balance of the global order, so carefully maintained, was starting to tremble. Historians looking back would call it the empire's paradox, a civilization built on hierarchy so rigid that it eventually froze. The obsession with purity fractured even the favored race into tiers of worth, until no one was secure enough to feel free. The system that promised eternal harmony had created only eternal supervision. By the century's end, the global order still stood, gleaming and organized, its cities perfect under perpetual light. But within that light lived shadows, millions whose names appeared only as numbers, millions more who feared the very perfection they were told to worship. The caste system that had once seemed unbreakable now carried within it the quiet certainty of decay. And somewhere in the archives of the empire's capital, a philosopher wrote a forbidden sentence in a private journal. When a world divides itself by worth, it forgets its own humanity. Part 14. The Great Dissonance. For more than half a century, the empire's rhythm had never faltered. Every factory, school, and ceremony moved in perfect coordination. The streets were clean, the speeches uniform, the statistics flawless. It seemed that history itself had accepted supervision. But perfection, like pressure, could not last forever. The first signs of fracture were almost invisible, small deviations buried in reports. Production quotas missed by fractions of a percent. Delays in shipments across the Eastern Colonies. A rise in absenteeism among workers with spotless records. At first, officials blamed logistics, weather, and inefficiency. They did not recognize that the system's own precision was eroding the human willingness to maintain it. In cities once renowned for discipline, citizens began to arrive late for work. They lingered in cafes, spoke more softly, and hesitated before repeating the slogans that once filled the air. What changed was not belief, but fatigue. The empire had demanded perfection from its citizens, and after generations of obedience, they had nothing left to give. Among the elite, a subtler decay took root. The high Aryan families, insulated by privilege, had lost the sense of purpose that once defined them. Their gatherings became elaborate but meaningless, banquets without conversation, ceremonies repeated for tradition's sake. Young heirs studied ideology by rote, quoting doctrines they no longer understood. Behind the marble facades of their villas, servants whispered that their masters had begun to envy the simplicity of those below them. The intellectuals felt the first dissonance in their work. Scientists who had spent decades perfecting systems of control began to question the premise of their experiments. They discovered that despite all the empire's data, human behavior remained unpredictable. Machines could measure compliance, but not conviction. Some began to write essays under pseudonyms, asking quiet but dangerous questions. What if perfection is not progress? What if control is decay? The arts, long domesticated, became the mirror of unease. A new style emerged in music compositions that began with the familiar order of imperial hymns but drifted into unresolved harmonies. Critics struggled to define it. They called it dissonant beauty. Orchestras played it reluctantly, but audiences listened with something close to awe. In the break between chords, they felt what they had forgotten, emotion unapproved by the state. Painters followed. Canvases once filled with clean lines and balanced symmetry began to show motion and blur. Figures melted into light, cities dissolved into haze. A young artist from Vienna painted a series titled Faces Remembered, portraits of people without names, rendered in tones so pale they seemed to fade as one looked at them. The exhibitions were officially dismissed as technical studies in perception, but those who saw them understood their meaning. They were ghosts of a forgotten conscience. Writers rediscovered metaphor. Short stories circulated through underground journals, tales of machines that refused to obey, of archivists who discovered missing files, of dreams in which colors not found on the Empire's palette suddenly appeared. The censors read them carefully and found nothing seditious in their words, but something in their tone unsettled readers. They spoke not of rebellion, but of yearning. Even religion, long mechanized, began to hum with quiet life again. Congregations prayed with closed eyes instead of open ones. Clergy who had memorized state-approved liturgies began to improvise subtle changes, a pause, a word unscripted, a phrase that suggested forgiveness instead of duty. Worshippers noticed, and for the first time in generations, tears returned to the temples. The empire's leadership responded with efficiency. New decrees reaffirmed order, productivity, and harmony. Additional censors were installed in factories and schools. The Bureau of Communication expanded its reach, filtering every piece of public media. Citizens were reminded that deviation was disorder, yet the tone of these proclamations revealed anxiety. Even perfection had learned to fear. Technology, once the empire's instrument of control, began to betray it. The central data grid, now vast beyond comprehension, could no longer process the contradictions accumulating within it. Machines flagged inconsistencies in loyalty scores, ancestry files, and census records. A program designed to predict human behavior produced nonsensical results. It had begun to recognize empathy as an error variable. Students, raised on the promise of certainty, found themselves drawn to uncertainty. Philosophy, long absent from education, re-emerged in whispers. Teachers began to discuss forbidden thinkers in private study circles. Terms like freedom, conscience, and soul returned to conversation, words so old they sounded almost new. Some students left the academies altogether, traveling to the countryside to live without the Empire's schedule. Officials labeled them voluntary inefficients, yet their numbers grew. In the colonies, the Great Dissonance manifested differently. The people who had lived for generations under the weight of supervision began to reclaim fragments of identity. Musicians revived old instruments, poets recited verses in languages thought extinct. The authorities tolerated it at first, dismissing it as harmless folklore. But folklore, once remembered, became history, and history carried the seed of defiance. By the mid-1980s, cracks appeared even in the Empire's architecture. Buildings constructed for eternity began to crumble under their own mass. Engineers discovered that concrete poured with mathematical perfection had become brittle with time. They repaired the structures, yet citizens whispered that the decay was symbolic, the stone itself, tired of bearing so much certainty. Propaganda adapted in tone, shifting from triumph to reassurance. Posters once proclaiming one empire, one future now read together, we endure. The language of destiny gave way to the language of maintenance. People sensed the change. It was no longer about glory, it was about survival. The most profound change came in the realm of silence. For decades, the Empire had controlled speech, but not thought. Now, as dissonance spread, it began to control neither. Citizens who had once repeated slogans out of habit began to hesitate before speaking them. In that hesitation, a spark of awareness returned, the smallest pause between obedience and belief. In one of the last official music festivals of the century, an orchestra performed a new symphony written by an anonymous composer. It began with the Empire's anthem, perfectly rendered, but halfway through, the melody shifted. Instruments fell out of sync, rhythm scattered, and then, after a long moment of chaos, a single violin continued alone, playing a simple, unmeasured tune. The audience listened in stunned silence. When it ended, no one applauded. They simply stood, unsure whether what they had heard was art or revelation. Within the upper echelons of government, reports multiplied about declining morale and loss of ideological coherence. Committees debated reforms, less control, more creativity, but each proposal contradicted the Empire's founding principle. To loosen control was to admit it had been too tight. To maintain it was to risk collapse through exhaustion. The perfect machine had reached the limits of its own logic. By the end of the century, the Great Dissonance had no leaders, no slogans, and no borders. It spread not through rebellion but through realization. Workers began to ignore minor regulations, teachers assigned unapproved literature, families left their televisions off at night. The Empire's vast systems still functioned, but fewer hands bothered to keep them running. The silence that once meant obedience now meant indifference. Historians of later ages would call this the most peaceful revolution in history, a collapse not of violence but of conviction. No barricades were built, no armies marched. The Empire simply began to forget why it existed. When future generations studied the Great Dissonance, they saw it as the moment when the human spirit reawakened beneath the machinery of control. It did not shout, it whispered. It did not destroy, it remembered. In the cracks of perfection, people rediscovered imperfection, and within imperfection, meaning. The Empire endured for some years more, its light still bright, its ceremonies still grand. but in the quiet spaces between them, something new had begun to breathe. Part 15. Twilight of the Empire. The Empire did not fall in a single day. It faded the way light leaves a room, slowly, gently, without anyone noticing when darkness truly began. There were no uprisings, no declarations of independence, no great speeches to mark its end. It simply dissolved into the same silence from which it had once claimed to rescue the world. By the early 21st century, the machinery that had once sustained the Reich still functioned, but without conviction. Ministries met, reports were filed, and parades were held, yet none of it seemed to matter. People attended because they always had, not because they believed. The Empire's calendar of holidays continued, but the crowds were smaller each year. Children sang anthems out of tune, their teachers correcting them gently but without enthusiasm. Technology remained flawless, but purpose had vanished. Trains ran on time to cities that no longer needed them. Vast archives stored every document the state had ever produced, yet no one read them. The central authority grid still pulsed with data, measuring loyalty, productivity, and ancestry, though no one acted on the results. Bureaucracy had become its own religion, a faith practiced long after its gods were forgotten. The ruling council met for the last time in a building of glass and steel overlooking Berlin's empty parade square. They spoke of declining birth rates, economic stagnation, and cultural erosion. None dared to name the truth. The empire's foundations, fear, obedience, and pride, had quietly crumbled. The very order that once united humanity had exhausted it. Among the people, change arrived not as revolution, but as forgetting. Citizens stopped renewing their identification cards. Factories closed without official notice. The nightly broadcasts continued to play patriotic hymns, but fewer and fewer tuned in. Streets that had once echoed with the rhythm of marching now filled with the softer sound of conversation. In the universities, students studied history as if awakening from a long dream. They discovered that the textbooks they had inherited contained more omissions than facts. Professors encouraged open discussion, cautiously at first, then freely. Words once banned returned to vocabulary: justice, equality, compassion. The rediscovery of these ideas felt not rebellious, but restorative, like finding an old photograph of someone long loved and long lost. In the colonies, the shift was equally quiet. Local councils began to govern themselves, at first administratively, then spiritually. The empire's banners still hung above official buildings, but they were faded, ignored. Trade continued, but on new terms. The people of Africa, the Middle East, and South America began to rebuild their own histories, tracing the erased lines of memory. Their songs returned to open air, their languages to the classroom. The empire's officials noted this with indifference. It was easier to allow change than to oppose it. Within the cities of the Reich, something beautiful and strange began to happen. Art returned to the streets. Painters used walls once reserved for propaganda to create murals of faces, faces of every color, every expression. Musicians played on corners, their melodies improvisational and alive. The old discipline, which had turned creativity into obedience, now yielded to spontaneity. For the first time in living memory, laughter became common. Religion followed. Temples once lit by fluorescent precision now glowed with candlelight again. Sermons no longer praised the state, but spoke of kindness, forgiveness, and wonder. Faith rediscovered humility, and in doing so rediscovered itself. People gathered not because they were required to, but because they wanted to. Even the architecture of power began to crumble in its own time. Monuments built for eternity cracked and weathered. Statues of leaders stood unguarded, pigeons resting on their shoulders. No one tore them down, they simply ceased to command attention. The empire's capital became a museum of its own history, its citizens the quiet curators of a civilization that had finally grown tired of itself. The final generation of imperial administrators wrote reports describing the transformation as the long decline, but historians of the future would choose another term, the awakening. It was not destruction, but released the slow reemergence of conscience after a century of silence. In the countryside, families gathered to celebrate festivals that no longer belonged to any state. Children danced around fires while elders told stories their ancestors had whispered in secret. Across continents, the boundaries that once divided Aryan, African, Asian, and Latin blurred back into humanity. Differences no longer defined rank, they simply described variety. By the middle of the 21st century, the empire existed only as an administrative shell, an aging bureaucracy presiding over a world that had outgrown it. The Council's final decree, recorded in dry language, announced the restructuring of global governance into regional autonomy. In truth, it was a quiet surrender. The machine had finally learned that control was not the same as stability. The last broadcast from the Imperial News Service aired on a spring evening. Viewers expected the usual announcements, but instead the screen filled with a single image, a sunrise over the ruins of the old parliament. A voice read a simple statement. History was built to be remembered, not repeated. May those who come after us build with gentler hands. Then the signal ended, replaced by static. Across the continent, people stood in their living rooms listening to the silence that followed. It felt like the world exhaling after a very long breath. In the years that followed, communities began to govern themselves again. Councils replaced ministries. Conversation replaced decree. Knowledge once locked behind ideology was reopened to all. Schools taught the full story, the triumphs and the tragedies, and from understanding, empathy returned. Humanity learned again to live with uncertainty, to see beauty in difference, to find strength not in purity but in compassion. Nature, long managed like a machine, also began to heal. Forests reclaimed land once stripped for uniform agriculture. Rivers ran clearer. The air grew lighter. In cities once shrouded in the glow of endless order, stars became visible again. Children, seeing them for the first time, asked what they were. Parents, no longer afraid to admit wonder, said, "They are reminders that we do not control everything." Historians would later write that the empire's greatest achievement was its own ending. By perfecting the machinery of control, it revealed the futility of domination. By suppressing chaos, it forgot that creativity is the engine of life. Its twilight was not failure, but transformation, a return to balance between structure and spirit. And so, as the 21st century unfolded, the world entered a gentler dawn. The cities of the old empire still stood, their architecture weathered but inhabited by new generations who no longer bowed to ideology. They built schools where questions were encouraged, studios where art was unplanned, and temples where silence meant reflection rather than fear. No single nation ruled. No race claimed destiny. Humanity, scarred but wiser, learned to exist not as master of the world, but as part of it. The lesson of the empire endured in every rebuilt village and every rediscovered story, that progress without empathy becomes decay, and that freedom, once remembered, is the most enduring act of creation. The empire that had sought eternity was gone. In its place remained a world uncertain, imperfect, and alive. And so, our journey through this imagined empire comes to an end. A world that sought to perfect humanity, only to discover that control can never replace compassion. In its silence, we found echoes of our own history, reminders that freedom, empathy, and memory are what truly make us human. Thank you for taking this quiet journey with history to relax. If you enjoyed tonight's story, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a message in the comments telling us where you're listening from. Every message helps our little corner of history grow, and it means the world to know who's out there sharing these moments with us. Until next time, may your evening be calm, your thoughts gentle, and your dreams filled with the lessons of the past. Sleep well, and remember, even in darkness, history still whispers.